Hi, welcome to Putting a Flex Face on Alfresco, Part 2. In Part 1, we created this simple Flex application that allows you to log into Alfresco and it stores the Alfresco session ticket, and that's as far as it goes. In this session, we're going to take it to the next level. We're going to actually retrieve some content from Alfresco and display it in the Flex UI. The content that we're going to display is in a space that we created called Employee Data. And in Employee Data, we created a space called Images that holds about 10 images. We wrote a custom web script to get these images, to get a list of these images. And we're going to invoke that web script from Flex, and we're going to display those images in the Flex UI. So let's write the method to invoke the Alfresco web script. We'll call it load images. If I can type. We'll have a variable to hold the parameters that we're going to be sending to the Alfresco web script. Now this object doesn't need to be called params. We can call it anything we like, but params is a good convention because after all it holds parameters. Now the object type in ActionScript 3 is a dynamic type, so we can create arbitrary properties for it, and we can create as many as we like. So we're going to create a property called alf ticket, because that's the name of the Alfresco ticket that Alfresco expects. And we're going to assign it the value of the ticket that we got from Alfresco when we logged in. This is a private variable that holds the ticket, the session ticket that Alfresco returned us when we had a successful login. Next we need our HTTP service instance. We're going to assign the URL to this HTTP service, and this is something we would never do in a production application. We would not hard code a URL in a production application. However, for our purposes here, it's fine to do this. We have a service called employee service, and that has a method called getImages. That's the method that we're invoking with this HTTP service request. The HTTP method for this service will be get. And because it's get, our parameters will be appended to the URL as a query string, just in any other HTTP GET request. If we set this to post, then our parameters would be sent in the same way as an HTML form. Now, when we invoke the send method of an HTTP service, it returns an async token instance. And that async token is useful for a number of things, one of which we'll see in just a moment. Just notice that we pass our params object as the argument to the HTTP service send method. That way our parameters get sent with the request. Now we're going to call the addResponder method of our async token instance, and we're going to pass it a reference to our application instance, this. Since we're passing that to the addResponder method, it's going to have to implement the iResponder interface, and this way our application instance will handle the response from the server on this request. So let's implement the iResponder interface. Start with the implement statement. In order to implement iResponder, we need two methods. We need a result method and a fault method. Before we write those, let's create a variable to hold the images that come back from Alfresco. We'll make it an array collection. And now we'll write our result method. It has to be public. and it takes one argument of type object. There's the signature of our result method. It needs to be public, and it needs to take one argument of type object. We know in this case that the actual argument is going to be of type result event. But in order to comply with the iResponder interface, we need to write our method this way, taking an object type. But because we know we're getting a result event, we know that it has a property called message, and the message has a property called body, and that is our payload. Result event.message.body is our payload. And because we wrote our Alfresco web script to return XML, we know that our payload is XML. Result event.message.body returns an object type, so we'll have to cast it to XML. Let's do that now. Now, this XML has a list of image elements, and that has the data that we want to display. So we'll store that in an XML list. And this is very easy with E4X, because just xml.image takes care of that. So now we have our XML list of image elements. We're going to loop over that XML list of image elements. And we're going to use data from those image elements to populate our array collection. Each image element has a child element called file path, and that's what we need for our current purposes, the path to the file, so that we can display the image. That's our result method. Now let's create our fault method. Again, it takes one argument of type object. There's our fault method signature. For our purposes, it'll be sufficient just to trace out the fault if we get one. There's our fault method. So, we've written a method to invoke the Alfresco web script. We've written a method to handle the response from Alfresco, and we've stored the data that we need returned from Alfresco. Now we need to display those images. In order to do that, we're going to use the classic display shelf component created by Eli Greenfield. And I have that here in our local source directory under com, quietly scheming, display shelf. So we'll need to add that namespace, and we'll call the namespace QS. Now that we have the namespace, we can add an instance of the component to our UI. We'll give it the ID of shelf. The data provider, of course, will be our array collection that we just populated, and we'll center it. Now, we have our UI component to display our images, but we haven't yet called our first method to load the images. So let's do that now. We'll do it in the onLoginComplete method. This is the method that gets invoked on a successful login. This is where we store the Alfresco ticket. This is where we hide the login panel, and this is where we will invoke the method that will request our list of images from Alfresco. We'll save it, let it build, look for any problems. Don't see any problems. Let's see what happens when we run it. There it is, our nice display shelf populated with images from our Alfresco repository. Thanks for watching Putting a Flex Face on Alfresco, Part 2.